It is the 21st century. There are too many video games. But out there, it's waiting. The best video game you've never played.
Hello and welcome to The Best Video Game You've Never Played, the podcast where I invite guests on to try out brand new video games that they've never played before, and then ask them, is this the best video game you've never played? And then they say, yes, this is great, thank you very much, you may have the name of my firstborn child as your own, or they say, no, be gone from this place, I have salted the earth where you stand, and if you shall ever return 1,000 years of plague upon you and your family. This week's guest is the return of Charles Deane, who you may recall came on and brought Sniper Elite 4, and I've given him a mysterious, spooky, and altogether old video game. Let's see how he gets on as we listen to Charles's return to the podcast. Hello, Charles. Welcome back.
Hello.
How are you doing? How's the wife?
The wife is fine.
Are you sure?
No longer married. But you know.
Are you sure the wife hasn't been dragged into the middle of a mysterious lake?
Oh, I see. This was a reference to the game that you've asked me to play.
Yes, we're straight in. We're straight in.
Cracking on.
On.
In that regard, the wife is not at the bottom of a lake, apparently, or maybe is at the bottom. I don't know. I don't know how the wife is, Lewis. I don't think
nobody knows how the wife is, Charles, because I've invited you back onto the podcast after assigning you the best video game that I think you've never played, which is Alan Wake.
Alan Wake.
Now, Alan Wake originally came out on the Xbox 360 as an Xbox 360 exclusive, something that I was very excited about back in the day because I owned an Xbox 360. And I was catching up. I didn't get it when it came out originally, but it came out in 2010, and it is an action-adventure game, third-person shooter developed by Remedy, who more recently made Control, which is another freaky-deaky third-person action-adventure game, and it is one of the most original premises for a video game within the realm of video games. I think it's genuinely one of the more interesting things I've seen because it's about an author who, through a series of supernatural machinations, ends up trapped in the novel he is yet to write and must go through a series of supernatural shenanigans in order to escape, ? So I think this game's great because it's a very unique setting, a very unique story, and I think the gameplay is, at the very least, quite exciting. So, Charles, what is your first impression, your first take on Alan Wake?
Well, I have a slightly different opinion from you, Lewis, which is good, because otherwise this would be a very boring podcast. We'd be ending it here, just over 2 minutes in. I think there's something to be said about the premise. I think it is an interesting premise, but I think it's a little bit more flawed than you have described. I don't think it's about an author who is trapped within the book he is about to write. I think it is an author who is trapped in the video game adaptation of the book he is about to write. And video game adaptations of books and films and TV shows and so on generally aren't all that good. I think it's pretty good in terms of the genre of video game adaptations of books, but I think it was clunky. I don't think the story translated well to the medium of video games. I think there's some interesting things that it does. I think it has some interesting sort of tonal things, and you can very much tell that Remedy then went on to make Control and went, what if we made a game instead?
So that's very interesting to me, because I think one of the things we should point out from the top of this is that you've said it's like a video game adaptation of a book, of the book he is yet to write, and that's the problem, is it's sort of the adaptation, like they're working within a genre that doesn't make sense for the type of game they've made. Is that kind of
I think I just don't think I was super engaged in the story that they were telling.
Right.
And I think that is because the medium for me was wrong. If this was... I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, you could make a great TV show out of Alan Wake. But, like, if it was a TV show, like, it's set up in that sort of episodic manner.
It is.
But it's not... I wasn't engaged enough by the things it was asking me to do. It felt repetitive, and I didn't care about any of the characters, and the acting is bad. and you know,
Well, look,
not to hold up video game acting as some sort of, like... thing that needs to be protected, as if all video game acting is magnificent, but it was so stilted and so dry. And I will say, you know, in Control, I think the acting in Control is also bad, but at least it's backed up by a really fun game.
So look, this is the thing that I find really interesting about this, because this is by no means Remedy's first game. Their first game are the Max Payne games. And Max Payne starts off a trend that Remedy is still doing to this day, which is that Remedy are obsessed with putting actors in games and then having the person voice that actor not be the same person that they've put in the game. So Max Payne's face is one of the developers' faces, and then he's voiced by someone else. Alan Wake's face is the face of an actor from... I want to say, is it Sweden or Norway that Remedy's based in?
Scandinavia.
They're Finnish. They're neither. They're a Finnish studio.
Oh,
so
the other one.
Alan Wake is a Finnish actor who is voiced by an American, and they're different. And it's not the same person. And I think they do it again in Control. And of course, Remedy also. We're talking about Alan Wake to Control like there isn't a step in between. There is a step in between, and it's called Quantum Break. And Quantum Break was literally a video game and a television show at the same time. So I think Alan Wake is a really interesting way to look at Remedy Entertainment, because it's clearly the wrong path. Like, they basically, they start with Max Payne and they make a cinematic story game. They go into Alan Wake and they're like, but what if it was kind of like a TV show? They then make a TV show. That game dies on its arse. And then they go, as you say, what if we just made a video game?
Yeah, and to be fair, I also want to say, like, in terms of the acting being bad, I was vaguely aware of what you were talking about in terms of it, because it's got that sort of, you know, it does... you know, everyone does look, I don't want to say real, but like that uncanny valley of, we've really tried to make this look like a person, but not quite. But for
2010, it's good. For 2010, they look really good.
I think it's a fine-looking game for 2010. But again, I don't think the issue is that the faces don't match the voice. I just think that the voices are bad. And I don't care. I don't care about what anyone has to say or do. Or, you know, like, Alan Wake is sort of this... you know, he's sort of supposed to be this, like, sort of Stephen King-esque author, in that he is in that he himself is supposed to be this personality in the world that people are aware of, you know. You know, people buy Alan Wake books, and there is you know, in the cafe you go to at the very start, there's a big stand-up poster of Alan Wake. Why it's in this cafe, I don't know. They didn't know he was coming.
A big fan,
but like, they
love Alan Wake.
but like, he then comes in, and he sort of does this droll thing of like, oh, I hate these big stand-up posters, and I'm like, do you? Like, do you hate them? Or like,
he does.
It just feels very sort of stilted, and yeah.
Nobody hates Alan Wake more than Alan Wake, which is the point of the game, Alan Wake.
And yeah, like,
also when you say he's meant to be a Stephen King-esque, like, figure in the world, he is just Stephen King.
Yeah, like he's
it's just so obviously the case. Like,
yeah.
They make direct references to Stephen King in the game, to the point where they literally copy a shot from The Shining, and then Alan says, this is like The Shining.
Yeah, it's, you know, I don't care about Alan. I don't care about his wife. I don't care about anyone else in the game. I do. I say, I think it's an interesting premise. I think it's an interesting premise for a story. I don't think it's an interesting game to play. I think I spent a lot of the time wishing I was playing a better game. And it's, it'd be unfair to say I spent a lot of the time wishing I was playing Control, because these games were made nearly 10 years apart from each other. But I spent a lot.
They're very similar games in that respect. They are both third-person shooters.
They're third-person shooters with a sort of horror theme, and where things are kind of like reality is twisting and warping and so on and so forth. But I think it'll be unfair to compare it, because we've had this, as a studio, they've had 10 years of development time to sort of practice making games, and technology has moved on. Like, it was never going to look as good as Control, for example.
No, but I think, again, just to make that point, this game came out in 2010, and for 2010, I think it was probably one of the best looking games of its time.
It may well have been one of the best looking games of its time. I think the people in 2010, oh boy, if they could see 2020 games, they would be shocked. But I also, but I think just the gameplay there was a bit in like the second, it's not really level, like second chapter or episode or whatever, where I spent far too long trying to maneuver a crane carrying some logs so that I could use them as a sort of bridge to climb up onto some other logs and finish the level. And
really?
I could not figure out what was going on and how to get them into the right position and how to get on top of these logs once I'd moved into the right... Like, the controls were clunky, the movement was janky. I think it's...
This really surprised me, because I literally replayed that yesterday to know... I mean, look, I'll be honest, I'm playing it on the computer, so that might be a factor. I don't know if playing it on the computer means that, I'm playing on a computer that's more powerful than an Xbox 360 would run the game, and I've got mouse and keyboard. But the section you're describing, I literally know the section you're describing because I played it yesterday, and it was not an obstacle. It was just like a thing I had to do.
Well,
is the Xbox version especially bad to control?
It felt so incredibly loose, it felt so incredibly janky, but also, Lewis, crucially here, something that happened, which some people might go, oh, isn't it interesting how the physics work like this? But like a barrel or something got in the way, and the crane was not powerful enough. Like, however they programmed it to move the barrel as it was moving these logs. So it just hit this barrel and sort of went, oh, stuck here. So that's why I spent a long time getting stuck. So I was like, well, it doesn't want to move that further. Oh, there's a barrel somewhere that I can't see, obviously. Yeah, and moving is horrible. Like, yeah, aiming's kind of fine, because it has a sort of like auto aim on it. But equally, most of the time you're aiming a torch. Ooh, like...
Well, we should talk about that, because I think that's one of the top unique mechanics of Alan Wake. So we've said Alan Wake is a third-person shooter, but crucially, the mechanic for Alan Wake is light and darkness. So essentially, the game's villain is a personification of darkness itself. And what it does is it infects people, and the only way that you can harm them is you burn darkness off them using a torch you have that has a incredibly easy to drain battery. And you have to... So the game requires that you aim at an enemy until they have lost the protection of the darkness, and then you can shoot them. So it's kind of like if Resident Evil 4 required that you aim at an enemy for about 5 seconds before you can shoot them.
Yeah, but you know what the fun mechanic of Resident Evil 4 is? You aim at someone and then you shoot them. And, you get a satisfying blood splatter and grunts and parasites popping out of their head. And it's like, ooh. Like, Alan Wake, the enemies literally are all the same because they're all just shadowy clouds. And then eventually they become, instead of a shadowy cloud, like a weird wobbly version of a man. And then you shoot it a few times, like, oh, that's done. And every now and then there's like a sort of boss where it's just one of those, but it takes longer to kill them.
There's also flocks of crows. They're a pain in the arse.
Yeah. that's the best way to describe it. They're a pain in the arse. They're not fun to deal with. Like...
I don't know. I quite like that it's a horror game that doesn't let you kill visible enemies straight away. I quite like that about it. That it's like you spot a pack of enemies, like 5 enemies coming towards you, and you can't just get rid of them. You have to strategically position yourself, find somewhere safe, burn off some of the darkness. Right, they're getting too close. Move somewhere else. Use the dodge to like cinematically dodge out of the way of something they're throwing at you. Like, I know that you didn't get to play the downloadable content for this game, because I also know you didn't finish the game. I'm right in thinking you didn't finish the game?
I did not finish the game. I think by the time I was done, I got like maybe 2/3 of the way through, but it's hard to tell from the pacing of the game.
This is true. The encounters do ramp up, and certainly I tried to play the downloadable content, and it was really hard. I could not complete the downloadable content in time to finish this, because I hadn't played Alan Wake for, looking at it, maybe a decade.
But I think the thing is, in terms of, saying, it makes you like, it's a horror game that makes you think about how you fight the enemies and having to do things strategically. It's not unique in that respect in terms of horror games. Like, we have obviously brought up Resident Evil 4, which is kind of more of an action-adventure game than a horror game, really.
Sure.
But there are tense fights in that which are more tactical, like the one where you're in the basement and you're being chased by the guy that you can only damage if you hit him with, nitrogen.
There's a unique boss fight set piece, yeah.
But also look at, like in the earlier Resident Evil games, a lot of the time the game is basically trying to say, don't fight this, run away. Look at Silent Hill, where most of the enemies can't be visibly damaged. It's not a unique thing. That's the thing. I think Alan Wake is kind of... And similarly, like the whole light and darkness thing, it's not unique to Alan Wake. Plenty of games have you go, you can't hurt this person until you've like put them under a spotlight, or you've put them in sunlight or whatever, because it's a metaphor. But I don't think it's fun or interesting to do that. I spend a lot of the time going, I'm out of batteries for my torch, so I just got to like run around in circles, waiting for it to recharge or find some batteries. Okay, now I can go back to fighting them.
That sounds like you're describing an encounter in which, like, oh no, I've run out of ammunition. I guess I've got to go find ammunition until I can use the gun again. I mean, look, I'm not gonna pretend Alan Wake has amazing combat. I think its combat is fine, and it's more interesting. Like, if they hadn't put in that light darkness mechanic, boy oh boy, would this be a generic third-person shooter game. Like, the guns are not interesting. They are quite slow. They have a reload mechanic, which is mash the reload button to reload quicker, which is just a bit like, sure, why not? But I think when you're saying, like, it's not unique to have a game where that mechanic's in place, it's unique to have a game where that mechanic's in place for every single enemy. Like, I get what you're saying, that, like, there are bosses where you have to, like, put them in situations where they become vulnerable, or there are, like, enemy types in games that you have to do this and then that to do it. But the thing I like in Alan Wake was more this idea that you are not in a situation where, if you have, like, a fully stocked arsenal, if you have the RPGs or, like, the flares or whatever, or every single, like, possible piece of ammunition you've got, you can't force your way through an encounter without engaging with that light mechanic. You have to burn the darkness off every enemy. You have to figure out, how am I going to best effectively use... Like, you get flashbangs later in the game, which, like, instantly burn off all the light off all the enemies. But then you're like, well, I've got a limited amount of these, so I have to, like, group the enemies together. And you mentioned how in Silent Hill, or in some Resident Evil encounters, they're like, oh no, run away. That also works in Alan Wake. You don't have to kill everything. You can run away. And some encounters in the downloadable content require that you run away, because you are not going to win.
But I think the thing is, Lewis, for me, going... So again, it's a very common trope in video games to be like, okay, you use the flashbang example, to be like, I've got this really cool, whether it's a grenade or it's an RPG or whatever, this will be really useful, and then you end up just not using it because you're like, no, this might be more useful later, until you kind of reach the end of the game and you haven't used any of your flashbangs or whatever. I don't.
I'm not
and
sure,
the other thing is,
I'm
I don't think the execution of that light mechanic. Like, again, you say, you've got to think about it. Okay, the way you think about it is you step back a bit, get my torch out. Like, there's very rarely an interesting time. Like, there are occasions, but there's very rarely an interesting time when it's like, okay, you've really got to sort of try and work your way around this. Like, I don't want to be too Legend of Zelda about this, but like, if there was like a bit where you have to start, like, I can't get the torch to hit this enemy, but what if I bounce it off this mirror around a corner? Or, sort of just stuff like that. Anything to make this light mechanic more interesting than just standing there holding your torch and going 3, 2, 1. Okay, now I can shoot him. Bang, bang, bang.
No, I think that's fair enough. I think there's definitely something to be said for the fact that when you're saying like, oh, there's no like, using mirror light as an example for a type of puzzle, Alan Wake is not a game with many puzzles in. I think it has one or two, and they're all quite rudimentary. They're all quite straightforward, like, please pull this lever to open this door. Or you mentioned earlier, move logs to form a platform so you can get through a section.
Yeah, I think you're being very, very like harsh about that log puzzle, Lewis. That was incredibly difficult to figure out.
For you it was, because apparently the game put a barrel there that wasn't supposed to be there. But like, Alan Wake is not about puzzles, as it were. It's about that light-dark fighting. But actually, I'm going to be honest, I don't even think Alan Wake's like lighty-shooty gameplay mechanics is why I like this game. I think that mechanic is fine. I think it's something they actually do much better in the pseudo-sequel, which I would like to talk about later with you, because in a way that I think that game has some more interesting things going on in it, but there's no way I would start you with it. The reason Alan Wake is interesting to me is the plot, but not what happens in the plot, if that makes any sense. I like that Alan Wake is about something in a video game that I have never seen done in a video game. I've never seen a game that is essentially about a sort of literalization of an author's ego, death, and mental breakdown. And I found that side of the game really interesting, and that's what compelled me to originally finish it, and then get the DLC, and then get the thing. And now I'm currently playing through Control, because I'm looking forward to getting to the section where I can get to the Alan Wake DLC. I am invested in Alan Wake. I do like Alan Wake, the character, and I do want to see what happens to him and Bright Falls. And a character that I don't think you've met because you didn't get to the stage where he's introduced, but there's a character called Mr. Scratch who forms the centre of my interest with this game.
I don't think so. It doesn't ring any bells.
I'm not going to give you any like harsh criticism in terms of like you didn't finish the game, and I said you didn't have to finish the game, and you clearly got bored of it. And I don't think if you'd carried on playing it, you would have had your mind changed. But the thing that I love about Alan Wake is that as it goes on, it becomes clearer that what is happening in the game. So for the brief overview of the plot, Alan Wake is going to a town in the Midwest of America that's basically based on Twin Peaks, where he is going on holiday with his wife. He's been suffering from writer's block. He's under a lot of pressure to write the next book, and he's got a lot of imposter syndrome going on in his life. He's like, I clearly don't know what I'm doing anymore as an author, and I'm doomed, as it were. I'm trapped in a situation where I've got a lot of expectation on me, and I don't know how to deal with it. While he's there, his wife's like, maybe write your book in this cabin. I've booked you a session with a psychiatrist who can help you. And he reacts to this terribly, and he says, how dare you do this to me? He storms out, and then his wife gets kidnapped by supernatural forces. Something is going on in this town that he's gone to, and it's full of supernatural things. He dives in after her and ends up in his unwritten novel that he is sort of not there to write, but that he will write as a result of the events going on around him. That's the intro. That's episode 1 of Alan Wake. No video game is like that. No video game is even remotely about that.
But I would argue, Lewis, there's a good reason no video game is like that. In terms of this, as you say, this being the book that he's going to write based on what's already happened. Blah, blah, blah. So one of the things the game has is these collectible pages that you can find, which are supposedly pages from the book of Alan Wake or whatever. And every now and then there's something like, I think I will give it credit for this. Like, you'll get something where you'll read a passage and it'll be like, oh, I went around this corner and then I got attacked by, wolves. And you're like, oh, well, I'm coming up to that corner I mentioned on the pages, so I better get ready to be attacked. It works in terms of that regard. But one, it is an incredibly frustrating collectible. Like, I have nothing against collectibles in a game. I have nothing against trying to 100% a game. Nothing against trying to not care about it at all. But the fact that there are so many of them where it literally says, like, on the collectible page, you can only get this if you're playing on the hardest difficulty. And I'm like, I don't want to play this game on the hardest difficulty just to collect this stuff, just to get the full narrative of your plot. But again, I don't get, like, you spend a good, like, I don't know, like an hour at least, probably a bit longer, getting into, like, the meat of the game. And it's like, what is, we have discussed in the past, Lewis, the American Office. And it is not a uncommon thing for people to say, oh, don't bother with season 1 of The American Office. You've got to skip into season 2.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you can't sell me on season 1, you've probably lost me. I played this game. It's fair to say I would have given it more time than just that little, that little build up into.
I mean, you objectively have not played season 1 of Alan Wake.
But you know what I mean? Like what I mean is in terms of comparing the full run of the American Office to the full game of Alan Wake. I don't know. I feel like I got, at least halfway through the American Office, and I was still just like, what is there to care about in this? I think, again, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it definitely would have been an excellent TV show. But if it was a TV show, then and I didn't feel like I was being forced to engage with a kind of quite boring world. Like, I know you're saying it looks very good, but like by design, most of the game happens in the dark, at night, in fog. Yeah. And I'm like, this isn't interesting to look at. At least
it's atmospheric, Charles. There's atmosphere.
I don't care for the atmosphere. Again, to compare to Resident Evil 4, which again is an earlier game, and I think in a lot of respects tonally kind of similar in that it's like sort of horror, but not really like scary horror. But as you're going through, like, you have different environments and different enemies and different things to say. And I'm not saying Alan Wake would have been better if there was a castle level with a weird little, 2-foot-tall, whiny Spanish man there. I'm not saying it would be a better
I would like
game.
to say it would be a better game if that was in Alan Wake. I would be fascinated as to why that was in Alan Wake.
But, yeah, visually it didn't go anywhere. The gameplay to me, like, getting flashbangs. That's not an evolution of the combat.
You go into a mine at one point,
and again, like there are horror games which aren't like super big on gameplay. I'm doing air quotes, but you obviously can't see them. But like there are horror games where it's like it's not about the combat, it's not about this, which work really well. I think the more recent example that a lot of people refer to would be Five Nights at Freddy's, like as horror. Quite simple in terms of what the actual game mechanics are, but atmospheric and spooky. But the example I would actually use is Amnesia. Like, Amnesia is a horror game with, like, I think no dialogue, essentially. But that is incredibly atmospheric, is incredibly spooky, where there's literally no combat. And that I found incredibly immersive and engaging when I played it. And it's obviously also a much shorter game. Alan Wake, I was just like, why am I playing this? Like, it would be much more interesting to watch a actor on a set running through fog and going, oh, there's these shadows that I can't kill, than for me to have to deal with it. I may well really enjoy watching a Let's Play of Alan Wake, but playing it, I did not enjoy.
So look, I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and it's nothing that either of us can prove. I think you would enjoy this more if you could play it on a computer.
I doubt it. I really
because
do.
It is a lot less clunky on computer. Like because you have mouse aiming, and that does make a big difference, and also because it runs really well on a computer compared to the Xbox 360.
But again, as I say, it's not just about those controls. It's also about the other parts of the game that aren't combat based, where you're just dredging around looking for clues and trying to get to the next checkpoint that will signify the next part of the game. I'm like, I don't care. Okay. I don't want to do this. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing interesting about the combat, and there's nothing interesting about the bits in between the combat.
Okay, well, I mean, look, I know I'm not going to convince you of it otherwise, but I will say from the perspective of someone who does like this game, I think the combat is fine. I think it's probably... I will say this, and you will probably very strongly disagree with me on this. I think Alan Wake is a more interesting and better third-person shooter than Resident Evil 5.
And I'm not going to disagree with that, because I don't really
which
like
is interesting
Resident Evil 5.
Because here's the thing, I bought an Xbox 360 to play Resident Evil 5. And I was really disappointed that Resident Evil 5 was not as good a game as I thought it was going to be. But the two games that like sort of made me feel okay about it were Dead Space and Alan Wake, because I played those games and I was like, there's the third person horror action games I wanted to play. Hooray!
I mean, this is obviously this podcast is not about Resident Evil 5, but have you ever played it in co-op?
Yes, I actually played the whole thing in co-op.
Okay, because my observation on Resident Evil 5 is I still don't think it's very good, but it's definitely more fun in co-op, and it's definitely a game that was built for co-op. And the kind
Charles,
of
I've completed Resident Evil 6 in co-op, and you know what I learned by beating both Resident Evil 5 in co-op and Resident Evil 6 in co-op?
What did you learn?
Every game is better in co-op, Charles, because people are great. People make anything better, and I don't think it's to a game's merit that, like, it's to a game's merit that they incorporated a co-op mode. It is no surprise to me that any game with a co-op mode is better in co-op. I can't think of a single game that is worse in co-op, to be honest with you.
Well, I think...
Except maybe Bugs and Taz Time Busters.
I think we finally come to the conclusion of the podcast. I haven't convinced you that Resident Evil 5 is the best game you've ever played.
Largely because I have played it. But look, I'm going to admit now, and this won't help my case at all,
Huzzah.
which is that I really like the atmosphere of Alan Wake. I do like the story. I do care about the characters, and I don't have a fucking clue what's going on. It's just one of the most confusing stories I've ever been presented. And I kind of like the confusion. I kind of like that I don't fully understand what's going on. One of the things I'm looking forward to about picking up and playing the rest of Control and getting to the DLC in that is that I know Alan Wake's storyline pops up later in those games, and it won't make sense, and I don't care because I'll be happy to see him and find out what's been going on with him.
I will tell you, Lewis, that I have not played the Alan Wake DLC for Control either. I think Control's a great game. I still need to complete it, but it's just I've got to bet it's quite hard. So every time I keep replaying it, I'm like, I don't like this. But like, I'm interested enough in the world to want to keep playing it.
Yeah. Alan Wake ties into Control, and I think now that I know that makes sense, because a lot of Control is like, the world doesn't make sense. The world is like, it's kind of building on that sort of philosophical concept of like, there are things you can't perceive with your senses, and they create these supernatural phenomenon. But they're not supernatural, they're just not understandable to human conception. And then I was replaying the first episode of Alan Wake, and I was like, oh, I get it now. It doesn't make sense.
So here, I think Control is... I mean, it's the obvious comparison because, again, set in the same universe. I don't know if necessarily the same world, but set in the same universe anyway. Made by Remedy, third-person action game. I'll tell you, I'll say this. As I mentioned earlier, the acting, no better than in Alan Wake. The plot... makes, I would argue, not much more sense, maybe a little more, but only because they've just wholesale ripped off SCPs for their game. So if you know what an SCP is, you're kind of like, okay.
That's rude.
That's
very rude.
And true. But it is clearly a story, or it is more clearly a story designed to be a game. And the gameplay, again, I wouldn't say the weapons in Control or anything like that are more interesting than in Alan Wake. You get some interesting like powers and abilities, which are kind of neat. But the combat is more satisfying. And again, the bits in between the combat are more satisfying. And the environments are more interesting, kind of because part of the point is that the environments keep changing as you go throughout the building. You know, it is a game that keeps bringing up like fresh ideas and fresh concepts. And not necessarily like mind blowing. Like, I'm not going to tell you not going to tell anyone that Control is like the most groundbreaking game in the world. It's a third person shooter Metroidvania that does that probably as well as any third person shooter Metroidvania ever has.
I think crucially the mechanics in Control are much more like you get like telekinetic powers and the ability to like glide and these sort of things, and those I agree those are more suited to a video game narrative because it makes more sense that those are interactive elements that in a book are boring to read about but in a game are exciting to do.
And that similarly, if it was a TV show, I'd be like, man, I wish I could do that. I wish I could engage with these things.
Yeah, and you'd be like, what a cool visual. And the benefit of a game is, what a cool visual, I did that.
Yeah, whereas I don't want to do the things that Alan Wake is doing, because they're boring.
They're largely running around very dark forests, it's true.
Yeah, like...
I wanted to bring something up because it's something that's in both Control and Alan Wake, and it's one of my favourite things, and it's honestly one of the points of fascination because it ties into Mr. Scratch. I really like Remedy's commitment, no matter how bad an idea it is, to live-action cutscenes. I love it because there's a few... So in Control they do it a lot. There's like training videos where they film these live-action sequences, and it's very good in Control because they're at the level of graphical fidelity where you kind of do a double take on, is that a real person or is he an in-game person? And it actually works in Control really well.
But it also feels a bit Portal 2 in that you're not quite sure. Like, they're kind of... I wouldn't say they're necessarily all comedy, but there are definitely comic elements to some of them where the guys in those videos are just like, we've got this thing, it does something magic, we don't know how it happens. Oh, and it killed a man.
Yeah, and it's a bit like in Wall-E when they mix in the live-action Fred Willard as the guy's like, hey, everything's fine. Oh, no, we're leaving the planet. Everything's rubbish.
Yeah.
But so, like, one of the things that pops up in Alan Wake a lot, and I really hope you found some of these, because, again, one of the things I loved about this game was they have a fake television show called Night Springs, which is a series of live-action shorts inspired by the Twilight Zone, and I loved them. Because, bear in mind, again, 2010... The very idea that someone has the nerve to do live action cutscenes in a game at all is hilarious because they obviously have a terrible reputation at this point. But the fact as well, the game's just like, stand here and watch a television show that's just the Twilight Zone but done in 3 minutes, and I'm like, all right. I loved it. And I love that it's sort of like, it has this internal thematic idea. Like, Alan Wake is obsessed with its world building, but more importantly, like, selling you on the tone. So it has these Twilight Zone episodes you can watch that, when you watch them, are clearly made on an incredibly small budget because the first one is clearly filmed in a university lecture room. You've got radio shows that are scattered throughout that are like the Night Host radio show, who's a real character in the game, who you interact with, who is part of the plot, and you can listen to calls of him. And again, in the same way that the manuscript foretells things that are going on, the radio shows can act as foretelling of what's going to happen later on in the story, because you've got people calling and going, oh, my dogs are missing, and it's like, you wait, those dogs are going to turn up. And it's sort of like, the game is awash in its own references. It really wants to build a world not only like around the character, but to sell you, the player, on the idea that you're not coming into this game with just like, you know, oh, it's just you're going to shoot weird dark monsters and that's the whole thing. It's like, no, you're in a place. Bright Falls is a place you can learn about. It has a history. It has a media diet.
I don't care about Bright Falls. I don't want to learn about Bright Falls. And like, and I did come across the what was it called? The TV show
Night Springs.
Night Springs. Yeah. I did come across Night Springs, Lewis, and it came up on a little TV. And I was like, oh, this looks like it's going to be a little Twilight Zone parody. I don't actually care. You kind of move on to do something else rather than just stand in this one place and watch a tiny little TV screen within my TV screen, like, which is just.
But Charles, it has to be a tiny little TV screen because it's so low quality video.
But it's just, I just didn't care about it. And like, again, other games do this sort of like, I don't want to call it immersive because I think I was giving it too much credit, but this sort of like, hey, we're gonna have like, you know, like, finding lore throughout a game in audio format and in video format and in text format, which, you know, Alan Wake does all three of these and Control does all three of these, is not new. It is something that other people do, but it isn't integrated in an interesting way that I care about. Like, I think the game that does that best, that I've played, and this is just off the top of my head, I might think of another one later, I think the game that does that best is BioShock.
I was so thinking you were going to say BioShock. But, right, I put it to you. The only reason you think it's BioShock is because BioShock lets you play the audio diaries while you're playing the game.
Yes, what a fascinating and easy easy way to integrate things.
You can't do that with a TV show.
You can't do that with a TV show. Almost like introducing a TV show into a video game, which is a medium generally about moving from place to place, is a bad idea. The only game I've ever enjoyed the TV shows on, again I'm using air quotes, is in Grand Theft Auto when I do it. And even then I have to concede, I'm going to stop playing Grand Theft Auto for a bit and watch some, in hindsight, probably quite tasteless sketches. I don't think, unless you're doing it in a cut scene. A cut scene is obviously a separate thing where you're going, hey, look, we are going to remove you from the gameplay element for a moment, unless we're doing again, to come back to Resident Evil 4, quick time event, but where you're taking your control away and we're going to make you watch this thing and you're going to learn about this world and we're going to do whatever. Fine. Don't have me playing through your game and go, hey, we think this game is so boring that you're going to want to stop and watch our little TV show. That's an indictment of how entertaining you think your game is.
Look, it just sounds to me like you're being impatient with it. It just sounds to me like they've done this world building, they've done this lore, they've actually bothered to build it out. And the thing I really love about the Night Springs TV shows is that they're not direct lore about the world. They're thematically tied to what's going on. So they're kind of they're not like in BioShock, they're explicitly telling you the history of Rapture. In Alan Wake, they're dropping these parables, these little side stories about things that even in the world they're fictional, but they relate to what's going on within the world of the themes of the game. And that's cool. Games don't do that. Games don't do thematic world building. That's really interesting.
Lewis, first of all,
look,
I will debate that games don't do thematic world building. But second of all, I reserve the right to be impatient with it. I've come into this to play a game. And again, in Control, I haven't watched all of them, but I've watched some of those little videos because I'm engaged enough with this world that I want to learn a little bit more about it. I want to pick up on some of this world building that you're doing, whether it's thematic or literal. In Alan Wake, I'm just I'm out in the dark, scary forest, and I've been in the dark, scary forest a bit. Oh, now I'm in a boring white hut, and there's a TV playing. I could stay in the boring white hut and watch the TV, or I could go out into the dark, scary forest.
Right.
Both of these options sound dull to me.
I think that might be it. I think ultimately there's my fascination from Alan Wake comes from I was into the concept before I started playing it, and I was into the idea of the game to the extent that I was willing to take the game at the pace it delivers itself. And it is a slow pace, I will give you that. It's not a game that is Control is quite fluid in terms of its pacing. There's never a point where the game is don't shoot something outside of very specific briefings. The game is go to here and you're going to shoot a lot of things and use a lot of powers, whereas Alan Wake is okay, in this section Alan needs to go around the town and find out what's going on with this person, or Alan needs to find out more about the history of the town, and you can't shoot anything, you don't have the torch, and you are just kind of like The Witcher 3 running to different objectives on the map and talking to people. But they're very contained, scripted moments, and then you do get into it, and it's because the game is a linear storytelling game. That is the kind of pace it's expecting you to do it at. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to tell you that, and you're wrong for not liking it for being that, but I think it's wrong to criticize it for that. That's what it wants to be.
I'm saying I don't want that. And it's, I do get what you're saying, Lewis. And I think the Witcher 3 comparison is interesting. And I know we obviously we disagree on the Witcher 3 as a game. But crucially, when I'm doing that stuff, when I'm going around a town and chatting to people and blah, 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 I know that at the end of that, I'm going to get to do some sword fighting, and there's going to be a big monster, or there's going to be a bunch of enemies or something. Whereas in Alan Wake, once I've gone around that town, it's oh, now I've got to do a bit with the torch and the boring guns again. It doesn't draw me into the gameplay. And again, there are definitely there's an interesting story in there, I'm sure, but I'm just so busy sitting there going, oh, this doesn't I've never played, and maybe this would have been a good example of this, but I've never played. Oh, what is it called? I've brought it up now, and I can't remember the name of it. There was the PS3 game where it's got the origami crane on the front.
Heavy Rain.
Heavy Rain. I've never played Heavy Rain, and from the way you've said it, I get the impression you're not a big fan of Heavy Rain.
I've beat Heavy Rain twice. Heavy Rain is the most compelling video game that I think is written by an idiot.
But like from what I can see about Heavy Rain, like that whole game is kind of like that sort of slow pace. Like it's all quick time events for want of a better word.
Heavy Rain is an adventure game.
Yeah,
it's the same type of game as what would become a Telltale game later. It sort of predates Telltale games, but is largely the originator of that particular type of adventure game.
Yeah, like Alan Wake, I think wants to be an adventure game in that ilk, or in the same ilk as Monkey Island or whatever, or a Telltale game. But like, it wants to be an adventure game, but it also wants to be an action game, and I think it does both of them badly, and to the detriment of each other. I think if Alan Wake, I think if Alan Wake was a Telltale game for all intents and purposes, where you can't just go from place to place and you make like sort of little choices. Maybe there's every now and then a puzzle, because aren't puzzles fun when they work? But like that, and that I think it would work as that. And if they had committed to, guess what, darkness versus light action game, maybe they could have worked with that. Instead, it's both and neither. And I get the story doesn't fit the action elements to me. Like, I think if you're going to do this thing about like, oh, it's light versus darkness, all right, take away the gun, like take the gun away completely and make it a game where you can't actually kill any of these enemies, and where it is more about puzzling your way about getting around them. Giving me that gun makes me go, oh, okay, so you've got this sort of interesting thematic or metaphorical storytelling device, and then I'm going to shoot it, like, and similarly, Bright Falls. I don't care about the people in Bright Falls. I don't care about what's going on. I don't care if there's some sort of weird semi-magic conspiracy that they're all pretending not to know about, or maybe they've been brainwashed and only a couple of people know what's going on, because you're too busy then every 10 minutes going, all right, go shoot some things now. Pick a lane and commit to it. And I think, that's basically it.
That's very interesting to me. I mean, look, one of the things I think that's the development of Alan Wake is fair to say was very rocky. Like, the game you're playing is not the game that was originally intended. And I know we should judge the game that's in front of us. I think you've got a really strong point with the idea that maybe just take the gun out. Maybe just make it so that you take out, like, you can stun enemies with the torch and move on. Because I think you're right. That probably is a stronger metaphor gameplay thing, and like would change the expectation of like it's an action game, but it's not a particularly good shooting game. Like, as you said, one of the things that's kind of interesting about the shooting is it's kind of auto aim. Like, you don't get a crosshair on screen, and so long as you're pointing at least your torch at the enemy, you're gonna hit them.
Yeah, and it also has that thing where, like, Alan Wake is just a guy. He's just a guy. Why is he even so proficient with this gun?
Because he's American.
But I think there's kind of just feels weird, and it's not just that gun. You also get like the shotgun, you get the flashbangs, and he just knows how to use them. And I'm not sitting here saying like a gun is the most complicated thing in the world, and I'm sure at some point in the plot they go, oh, it's just like being on the shooting range. But I think anyone who's been trained in using gun will tell you that using gun on a shooting range is different than using it in a dark forest surrounded by scary shadow monsters.
Here's the question then, Charles. Does Alan Wake use a gun? Or does the fictional interpretation of Alan Wake written by Alan Wake know how to use a gun?
I don't care.
But that's the question I do care about. Look, so here's one of the things I wanted to bring up about Alan Wake that I think's really interesting, particularly based on that criticism you just leveled at the game. You're like, you're an adventure game or you're an action game. Pick a lane. Charles, They picked a lane because there is a pseudo-sequel to Alan Wake called Alan Wake's American Nightmare. And Alan Wake's American Nightmare is just an action game. They completely cut out the idea of the adventure element, more or less altogether. It's got a crosshair, it's got multiple weapons, including a nail gun. It has a horde mode. It is a full-blown action game version of it. And spoilers for the rest of Alan Wake for those people who haven't played it. my take is, I like it. I think it's good. Charles's take is...
What on Alan Wake? That
Go
it's bad.
on.
Here's the thing. I'll say, like, okay, and I'm sure there was a little bit that played into this, but you know what I'd say is the pseudo sequel to Alan Wake? Control, because it's got
but this is literally like...
No, I know, but I'm saying Control is the action game parts of Alan Wake made good and made fun, and. You know, you could make an argument that there is still like that sort of adventure element to it. And obviously this is a genre called action adventure. But Control is an action game first and an adventure game second. Whereas Alan Wake is...
It's not an adventure
game. Well, then an adventure game third or fourth or whatever. Like Alan Wake is a story which I think is better suited to being an adventure game that is trying to be an action game first and an adventure game second.
I think that's a legitimate criticism there, actually. I think you've got a really good point there, and I think that is definitely something that will ruin future playthroughs for me. But this equal Alan Wake's American Nightmare. So what happens in the game is that by the end of it, in order to rescue Alan's wife, he realizes that he will have to essentially take her place in the fictional dark world. And so he sort of makes this deal with the darkness, and the darkness goes, okay, while you're in here with me, this is Mr. Scratch, and it's a doppelganger for Alan. And he goes, Mr. Scratch is going to be taking your place while you're in here. And that's more or less how the game ends, is basically Alan surrenders himself to the darkness and Mr. Scratch takes his place. This pseudo-sequel, Alan Wake's American Nightmare, basically consists of Alan is going through the trappings of some fictional story that he's like become part of. Meanwhile, Mr. Scratch is telling him how much he's ruining his life on the outside, and he's talking to him through live action televisions and basically glaring at him through televisions going, I made your best friend cry today. How do you feel about that? And it's one of the most and this is the thing, I like Alan Wake the game, and I basically said play Alan Wake because it's largely the one that people like more, because Alan Wake's American Nightmare is also 2 hours. But I think there's something, I rarely care about a video game character's best friend. I rarely care about a video game character's like personal life or connections, and Alan Wake hooked me on that in a way that basically no other game of that generation, that video game generation, did. Like, Alan Wake sticks in my head as one of the very few reasons I'm glad I owned an Xbox 360. Because there were very few exclusive games on the Xbox 360 that I was like, what a cool, brilliant, original, unique thing. And Alan Wake, for all its flaws, I agree its gameplay can get repetitive and it's not as the most interesting thing in the world. Alan Wake is definitely the only game of its type in that generation of games.
I mean, I can't argue with you on that because I don't know of any other games like that. There's probably something out there, I'm sure, but you know, like, of course you like his friend. You know, of course you care about Alan Wake's friend because it's probably more interesting than Alan Wake. Like, they do go
into that later on. Like, you see Alan Wake doing like television interviews, and he talks about how much he hates the way that he presents himself in public. Like, Alan Wake is very obsessed with Alan Wake.
Yeah,
which is fair. I think we all are self-obsessed to some degree.
Very good. I think we're all obsessed with Alan Wake. Everyone in Bright Falls is. Oh, it's Alan Wake.
So look, I'm going to ask you in a sec I mean, we don't really need to ask you the question, but I have to for the sake of format. But before I ask you the question, this podcast is obviously brought to you by Energizer batteries. Energizer batteries are the perfect way for you to fight off evil demons, even though they apparently run out in about 15 seconds. What a weird product placement.
Yeah, like, I mean, again, there's a whole other discussion about product placement in games that aren't really thought through, but yeah, like... What a terrible way of trying to advertise your product. Like, if I was the people at Energizer batteries, what I would have said is, hey, what if through most of the game you've only got regular batteries, but then you get to the very end and Alan finds some Energizer batteries and he turns to camera and says, now we've got this sorted, and he puts them in, you never need to replace them again. That's the way to do your product placement.
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about product placement in Alan Wake is I think it speaks to this game was the result of a very long development cycle. It was the result of Microsoft intervening to help fund it. And it was originally planned to be an open world game with survival horror elements. And it gradually got watered down and watered down and watered down until eventually what you have is a linear action horror game that's not really a survival horror game, to be honest, in which they just basically push the plot in front of you as much as possible to get you through it because they don't have the development time or budget left to make the big open world adventure game they originally planned. And I think the Energizer batteries represent the level to which they were compromised, because it gets to the point where they're like, put an advert on the batteries, do something, we need money, we need to finish this game.
Yeah, that's sad. I'm not convinced open world Alan Wake would be better either, but that's sad.
I think the open world Alan Wake game would not have been as action orientated. I think it would have been the adventure game you said it should have tried to be.
And I can also see as well, like if Microsoft come in, or if any studio comes in, they go, who's going to buy an open world survival horror game where you don't even get to kill the bad guys? Let's give Alan a gun. Like I can see that
I think that's
conversation
why Alan
happening.
has a gun. I totally think that's why Alan has a gun.
And to which I say to Microsoft, go play Amnesia. Although I think Amnesia was released after Alan Wake, so maybe they couldn't.
And of course, Amnesia, like, I don't want to be glib about this. Alan Wake was a AAA release.
Yeah,
Alan Wake had a lot of money behind it. And again, for its time, it's a very impressive looking game. And it's like, you know, it had that big advertising behind it. Amnesia has the luxury of looking like, not looking great, but the expectation of it was it probably shouldn't look great.
Yeah.
So, Charles, is Alan Wake the best video game you've never played?
Well, Lewis, much as Sniper Elite 4 on a technicality was the best video game you've never played, I have no choice but to concede that Alan Wake is the best video game I've never played.
I don't think it is, though, is it?
No, I don't think it is either. There are other games out there that I am more excited to play, which I've never played. But I'm glad I played it. Like, you know, I think I went in with, I'm not going to say high hopes, with an open mind. You know, I remember when it was released, it kind of got like a mixed reaction, but it has sort of gained a cult following over the years. And, you know, again, it had multiple DLC packs, so there's obviously something to it. And again, I've really been enjoying Control. So I was like, this could be good. And I just don't think it was good.
The thing I find really interesting was I picked Alan Wake because you gave me a third-person shooter. And I thought the biggest flaw with Sniper Elite 4 was I did not find its plot compelling at all. I just thought, you know, whatever. But I love the mechanics, and I thought, actually, no, this is a fun, cool, like, quirky little game that's sort of not massively unique, but it has one unique idea that's really interesting. And I thought, I'll give you Alan Wake, because I think Alan Wake has a great story, and I don't think the mechanics are, like, amazing, but they're good enough to carry what I think is a great story. And then you came back and you went, I think my main criticism of Alan Wake is I don't like the story. And I've gone, well, that idea didn't work.
Well, again, it's as I say, it's not that I don't like the story, but I don't think the story fits the medium, and certainly not the genre of the medium that they have chosen. As I say, maybe if it was just a straight adventure story, a straight adventure game, I would be far more compelled to keep playing. But as it is, I feel like I am going through two half-assed versions of, like, if I want to play a third-person shooter, I can play Sniper Elite 4, or I can play Gears of War, or I can play Metal Gear Solid, or there's any number of games I can play. And if I want to play an adventure game, I can play, you know, some but not all of the Telltale games. I can play Monkey Island. I can play any number of things. I would never go back to Alan Wake to play as a game.
I mean, fair enough. I'm sorry it wasn't. I genuinely picked something I thought you would like, and I have apparently misunderstood your taste, and we shall never talk again. But thank you for coming on and doing the podcast, Charles.
Thank you very much, Lewis.
Well, that was Charles. Sadly, he wasn't a fan of Alan Wake, despite the fact that he obviously should be, because it's a great. I think it's a great video game. I thought it was the best video game we never played. He doesn't seem to think so. What does he know? I've played loads more video games than him. I don't know why he gets so high and mighty about the idea that he knows more about games. It's just no accounting for taste sometimes, is there? I saw a thing today saying that Shrek was really, really bad, and everyone's going, no, Shrek's really, really good. We'll never solve this. Art is a war. There are no winners. There's only death. If you like the podcast, please like, review, and subscribe to it. Do all the buttons, press all the things, 18 stars, and slap them all over the place. And, you can follow us on Twitter, at Game Never Played. It's a better tag now. It makes more sense. At Game Never Played. I can say that out loud, and I can understand and parse what that means. Thanks for listening. Stay safe.